Jersey, 2005, an 18-year-old boy named Tyler James Mancuso vanished without a trace. A hard-working high school senior and part-time mechanic apprentice, Tyler was known for his quiet heart and calloused hands. One rainy October evening, his car was found abandoned off a rural bypass. Doors locked, tools in the back seat, no sign of a struggle, and no sign of Tyler. What followed was a grueling investigation marred by silence, unanswered calls, and years of heartbreak. For nearly 2 decades, his family begged for answers, and got none, until now. A recent DNA breakthrough led to an arrest that stunned the community. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Brookfield, New Jersey in 2005 was the kind of town where everyone knew your name, your schedule, and your business. It had that quiet, almost frozen-in-time quality, white picket fences, family-run diners, and a rhythm that rarely changed. It was a town where football games still brought out crowds, neighbors lent cups of sugar without hesitation, and teenagers dreamed small but sincere dreams. 18-year-old Tyler James Mancuso was part of that rhythm. He wasn't the loudest or most popular kid at Brookfield High, but he was known as the boy with the calloused hands and the soft voice. The kid who wore the same beat-up flannel over his grease-streaked t-shirt. The one who was more likely to be found under a car hood than at a high school party. Tyler lived in a small, weathered house on Millstone Avenue with his mother, Elise. His father, Tony Mancuso, had died in a traffic accident when Tyler was just 7 years old. A jackknife truck on a rain-slicked freeway, they said. Since then, it had just been the two of them. Elise worked as a nurse at the local hospital, doing long shifts to make ends meet. Tyler never complained. He knew the value of hard work because it was all he had ever seen. By the time he was 13, he was spending hours in his grandfather Ray's garage, learning to disassemble small engines. Ray Mancuso, a retired machinist, wasn't a man of many words, but he didn't need to be. With Tyler, a shared silence was enough. They communicated through tools, through tinkering, through the kind of mutual respect that forms between two people with grease under their nails and oil on their hands. Tyler's world was small, but full of purpose. He didn't chase grades or girls. His GPA was a flat C average, and he barely scraped by in math. But in auto shop, he shined. His teachers noticed. His classmates noticed. And Chuck Benson, the owner of Benson's Auto Shop, definitely noticed. By 16, Tyler was officially working part-time at the garage, doing oil changes, brake jobs, and minor repairs. He was still a high school student, but already respected in the adult world of labor and tools. Chuck often joked that Tyler was born with a wrench in his hand. But it wasn't just a joke. Tyler had an intuitive understanding of machines, especially cars. He could identify the make of an engine just by sound. He once rebuilt a 1986 Ford Bronco's transmission from parts he scavenged at a junkyard. He didn't do it for school credit or social media clout. He did it because he loved it. That Bronco sat in the backyard for months, a project car that had become a symbol of his future. On its cracked dashboard, he'd once taped a hand-sketched logo, Mancuso Motors. It was more than a doodle. It was a declaration. He had plans. Not grand ones, no Ivy League dreams or wild ambitions, just a goal to graduate, go to community college for automotive technology, and one day open his own garage. He even talked about hiring kids like him. Quiet, overlooked, good with their hands. His routine was as reliable as a torque wrench. Wake up, school, work, home, dinner with his mom if she was off. A quick visit to Ray's if time allowed. Then bed, rinse and repeat. Tyler wasn't the type to skip school, sneak out, or stir drama. His life, like his repairs, followed a process. Despite his reserved nature, people in Brookfield respected Tyler. He helped neighbors shovel snow, mowed lawns in the summer, and offered to patch up bikes for local kids. He wasn't flashy, but he was present, and that mattered in a town like Brookfield. Elise adored her son. She was fiercely proud of his work ethic and maturity. She often said Tyler had an old soul, the kind that understood responsibility before rebellion. Still, she worried. He was a quiet boy in a noisy world, and sometimes silence could be dangerous. But Tyler wasn't completely isolated. He had a small group of friends, mostly from the auto shop class and the garage. They bonded over tools, engines, and shared frustrations with high school life. They'd gather behind the shop on Saturdays, swapping parts and jokes, dreaming about cars they'd own one day. One of those friends, Jason Lyle, would later say, Tyler didn't talk much, but when he did, you listened. He didn't waste words, and when he smiled, you knew it was real. By fall 2005, Tyler's life seemed steady. Senior year had just begun. He was working more hours at Benson's, and Chuck was starting to trust him with bigger jobs. He had finally saved up enough money to buy an old Civic he'd been eyeing. It wasn't pretty, but it ran, and to Tyler that was everything. October 17th started like any other Monday. Tyler went to school, did his usual shift at the garage, and called his mom around 5:30 p.m. He said he'd pick up a few groceries on his way home. It was an ordinary moment, the kind that slips through memory unnoticed, but it would be the last time Elise ever heard her son's voice. That evening, the weather turned. A steady rain began to fall, turning the road slick and reflecting the amber streetlights in long, glassy streaks. Elise dozed off on the couch, waiting for Tyler. She woke up at midnight. No sign of him, no text, no missed calls. Just silence. She called his phone. It rang, then went to voicemail. She called Benson's auto shop, thinking maybe he stayed late. Chuck confirmed Tyler had left before dark. Then she called the police. At first, the officers tried to reassure her. Teenagers wander sometimes, they said. Maybe he's with friends. Maybe his phone died. But Elise knew better. Tyler wasn't that kind of teenager. If he was late, he called. If he had plans, he told her. She felt it in her bones. Something was wrong. The next morning, police filed an official missing persons report. But without immediate leads, they had little to go on. Tyler's friends were baffled. No one had heard from him. No recent arguments. No strange behavior. He had simply vanished. Flyers were printed. Local news picked up the story. Volunteers canvassed neighborhoods. But there was no trace and no sightings, no abandoned car, nothing. For a boy who lived such a routine, visible life, his disappearance made no sense. There were no secrets to uncover, no troubled pasts or hidden enemies. And yet, Tyler was gone. Brookfield, a town so rooted in its sense of safety, suddenly found itself grappling with fear. Parents double-checked curfews. Teachers spoke in hushed tones. Every empty driveway felt heavier, because if a boy like Tyler, reliable, kind, predictable, could disappear, then anyone could. How does a boy so grounded, so visible, so known, disappear without a trace? October 17th, 2005. It was a Monday like any other in Brookfield, New Jersey. The air was crisp, the sun low in the sky by 5:30 p.m., and a slow drizzle had begun by late afternoon. The kind of evening where headlights caught the glisten of wet pavement, and the trees lining the back roads swayed gently under gathering clouds. Nothing about it suggested that the town was about to lose something it would never get back. At Benson's auto shop, Tyler James Mancuso was finishing his usual shift. He cleaned up his station, wiped the grease from his hands with a shop towel, and exchanged a few words with Chuck Benson, who was closing out the books behind the counter. According to Chuck, Tyler seemed perfectly normal, maybe a little tired but polite as always. He slung his backpack over one shoulder, told Chuck he'd see him tomorrow, and headed out into the dusk. Before leaving, Tyler sent a quick text to his mother. Heading to the store. Need anything else? She never responded. Her phone had died during her nursing shift. She assumed he'd be home by 9. Tyler never arrived. The rain picked up around 8 p.m., growing heavier as the night wore on. Elise Mancuso, freshly home from a double shift, lay down on the couch to rest her aching legs. She trusted her son's routine. Tyler didn't party. He didn't stay out late. He was dependable, always had been. By 10:15 p.m., she stirred awake. The house was silent, too silent. No footsteps on the porch, no keys jingling at the door. The clock ticked louder than usual. She checked her phone. No messages. She tried calling Tyler's cell. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. That's when the unease crept in, the kind that starts in your stomach and rises slow and icy. She tried again. No answer. Miles away, a state trooper named Kevin Holt was making routine rounds along Route 48, a sparsely lit 2-lane highway that cut through the edge of Brookfield and curved into forested back roads. At approximately 10:32 p.m., he noticed a car parked oddly along the shoulder, hazard lights off, driver's side slightly angled toward a drainage ditch. He pulled over. It was a 1992 Honda Civic, dented along the fender, with rust on the wheel wells and a missing hubcap, a car that had clearly seen better days. Holt ran the plates through dispatch. Registered to Tyler J. Mancuso of Brookfield. The report noted that the car was locked with no immediate signs of damage or distress. Peering through the window with his flashlight, Holt observed a cell phone on the passenger seat. A brown paper grocery bag sat upright in the footwell. Inside were a loaf of bread, a pack of chicken breasts, a bag of frozen peas. The items Tyler was supposed to bring home. The keys were not in the ignition. There was no sign of blood, no shattered glass, no broken door handles. The car looked undisturbed, just empty. Holt tapped on the windows again, called out Tyler's name, then circled the vehicle with measured steps. He shined his flashlight toward the tree line beyond the road, but the rain and darkness offered little visibility. The woods loomed like a black curtain behind the car. No footprints in the mud. No tire tracks besides Tyler's. The trooper radioed for backup and began a standard missing person protocol. Meanwhile, back at home, Elise was pacing. She'd called Tyler's friends. None of them had seen or heard from him. She called Chuck again. He confirmed Tyler had left hours ago. Her hands shook as she dialed the local police. By midnight, Brookfield officers were knocking on her door, gently informing her that Tyler's car had been found, but he was not with it. No signs of foul play. No signs of a crash, but also, and no signs of him. Elise's breath caught in her throat. No signs of him was worse than any confirmation of injury. It was limbo, the cruelest kind. Officers returned to the scene with canine units, hoping scent dogs might trace Tyler's path. The rain, now steady and cold, complicated things. The scent trail, if it existed at all, would have already begun to fade. By 3 a.m., search efforts had widened. Flashlights pierced the dark woods. Calls of Tyler echoed into the trees. Deputies trudged through the underbrush, soaked to the skin. The Civic was towed and impounded for further examination. Elise sat in her living room, staring at the front door, hoping the knob would turn, hoping her son would walk in and laugh at the fuss. But the door stayed closed. The next morning, the sun rose on a town rattled. News of Tyler's disappearance spread quickly. At Brookfield High, teachers paused their lessons. Classmates whispered in hallways. Posters with Tyler's face began appearing on utility poles and in storefront windows. The questions piled up fast. Why had he pulled over? Car trouble? But the Civic had fuel. No signs of mechanical failure. Could he have stepped out to make a call? Got turned around in the rain? But why leave the car locked? Why leave the groceries? Police examined the vehicle thoroughly. Fingerprint dusting turned up nothing useful. The phone inside was water damaged, likely from condensation. The last call made was to his mother. No outgoing texts after 6:30 p.m. No activity on social media. His bank card hadn't been used. And the strangest thing, his wallet was still inside the car, tucked under the driver's seat. Cash still inside, cards untouched. It was as if Tyler had simply evaporated. Investigators canvassed the stretch of Route 48. It was a known shortcut to and from town, often used by locals. There were no security cameras in that area, just miles of forest and the occasional farmhouse set back behind fences. Officers questioned nearby residents. One elderly couple thought they'd heard a car door slam around 9:45 p.m., but it could have been anything. Another neighbor recalled seeing headlights slowing near the bend, but couldn't confirm the make or model. No one had seen Tyler. No one had heard anything unusual. The working theory was that Tyler had pulled over, maybe to check something on the car. Perhaps he thought he heard a sound, a knock, a misfire. Maybe he stepped out and something happened. Slipped in the mud, got lost, or worse, kinked. Someone else was there. But why leave the door locked? Theories ranged from the mundane to the sinister. Maybe he'd had a mental break. Maybe someone had lured him from the vehicle. Maybe it was someone he knew. Police refused to speculate publicly. Privately, they had very few leads. Back at home, Elise sat on Tyler's unmade bed, clutching his flannel shirt to her chest. His room was untouched. Clothes in the hamper, homework on the desk, a wrench lying next to a notebook sketching out plans for a makeshift garage setup. The life of a teenager still in motion, now eerily frozen. The town held a vigil 2 nights later. Candles flickered outside the high school, and dozens gathered with umbrellas and bowed heads. Chuck Benson spoke briefly. Tyler is the kind of kid who shows up. We just need him to show up now. But as days turned to a week and a week into two, hope began to erode. No body, no crime scene, no witness, only a locked car, a forgotten bag of groceries, and an empty stretch of rain-soaked road. Why would Tyler leave his car? And where did he go? Pine Hollow Woods was a place most Brookfield residents passed without much thought. Tucked behind Route 48 and stretching out for several square miles, it was a patch of dense wilderness, pine, oak, birch, where old trails crisscrossed into nothing, and silence fell early with the canopy above. During autumn, the forest turned a palette of gold and crimson, but beneath that beauty, shadows lingered. For most, it was simply background scenery, but on the morning of October 20th, 2005, it became something far darker. By then, Tyler Mancuso had been missing for 3 days. Law enforcement had expanded their search perimeter beyond the roadside where his car had been found. With no concrete leads, the focus shifted to Pine Hollow, a logical but daunting next step. Search teams from surrounding counties were brought in. Bloodhounds, aerial drones, and even a helicopter with infrared capabilities combed the area. Volunteers from town showed up in layers of flannel and waterproof boots driven by a mix of fear and duty. Among them were Tyler's classmates, his auto shop instructor, local church members. Even Chuck Benson closed his shop to join the search. Brookfield may have been small, but it rallied big. It was a cold, damp morning when a deputy named Ellen Reyes stumbled across a piece of fabric caught on a thorny bush. She called it in, crouched low, and carefully dislodged what appeared to be a crumpled flannel jacket, faded red and gray. Soaked through, mud-streaked and half-hidden beneath fallen leaves, but unmistakable, Elise Mancuso later confirmed. It was the jacket Tyler had worn to work the day he vanished. The location was significant. The jacket was found over a mile from where his car had been discovered, deep enough into the woods that Tyler couldn't have simply wandered there by accident. Especially not in the dark. Especially not in the rain. Search efforts immediately intensified around the area. Canine units were deployed. Officers formed a grid pattern, moving inch by inch, eyes trained on the forest floor. Hours passed. Then a shout rang out. Beneath a layer of pine needles and disturbed soil, they found it. A shallow grave. The earth had been crudely disturbed. No markings, no cross, no indication of care. Just a hurried burial meant to hide, not honor. What remained of Tyler Mancuso lay hidden there. A partially decomposed body, face obscured, clothing tattered. It was clear this wasn't a peaceful death. The scene told a silent story of violence, panic and concealment. Forensics quickly confirmed what everyone feared. DNA, taken from dental records and previous medical history, verified the remains belonged to Tyler. The boy who had once fixed engines with care and precision had been discarded like debris in the woods. The official cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head. No weapon was recovered. No defensive wounds, no ligature marks. The blow had been quick, brutal, and likely fatal on impact. The location raised troubling questions. Whoever had done this had carried or dragged Tyler's body more than a mile through uneven terrain. That suggested strength, familiarity with the woods, or help. The burial was rushed but hidden well enough to delay discovery. It wasn't random, and yet no fingerprints, no tire tracks, no footprints. The rain, which had hampered the initial car scene, had again become the criminal's ally. Whatever trace evidence might have existed was long gone, washed into the soil or lost to time. Back in town, word spread fast. News vans parked at the edge of the woods. Reporters descended like buzzards, shoving microphones into faces of neighbors who barely knew what to say. At Benson's auto shop, the front window bore a black ribbon. At Brookfield High, students cried in hallways. The principal called for a moment of silence over the intercom, and Elise collapsed when the detectives arrived at her door. No mother is ever prepared to hear those words. We found Tyler. The 3 words that signal the end of hope. The beginning of grief. She didn't scream. She didn't cry at first. She simply dropped to her knees as if her body could no longer carry the weight of the world it now lived in. Later that evening, sitting in her son's room, she held the same flannel shirt he used to wear. The one that still smelled faintly of motor oil and detergent, the one she refused to wash even now. I knew. she whispered to the walls. I knew when he didn't come home. I knew. The community grieved in tandem. But beneath the sorrow, fear began to set in. Who would do this to Tyler? And why? He wasn't involved in anything dangerous. He had no known enemies. No history of drugs or violence. He wasn't the kind of teen who fell in with the wrong crowd. And yet, someone had taken him. Killed him. Buried him like a secret. Investigators released limited details to the press. The cause of death. The rough location. The timeline. They pleaded for information. Asked for tips. But leads were scarce. A few townspeople mentioned seeing a white van in the area earlier that week. But no license plate, no description of the driver. Someone recalled hearing strange noises in the woods days prior, but couldn't remember the exact time. One man swore he saw a shadowy figure darting across Route 48 near midnight. But his story shifted in every retelling. The crime scene, though revealing in its horror, offered little else. No discarded weapon. No usable DNA. The only certainty, Tyler had not died at the spot where his car was found, which meant someone had lured or forced him away. Meant someone knew those woods well enough to hide a body. Meant someone had likely walked among the searchers, the mourners, blending in unnoticed. Was it someone Tyler knew? Or a stranger who saw an opportunity? Was it premeditated or a moment of rage? In the absence of answers, Brookfield turned to speculation. Whispers in grocery store aisles. Rumors traded in whispers. Parents held their children closer. Curfews were enforced. Locks were checked twice at night. A memorial was held at the local church the following week. The pews overflowed. People stood shoulder to shoulder in silence, candles flickering in their hands. The pastor, voice shaking, said, Tyler was taken from us, but he will not be forgotten, and we will not rest until justice is served. But justice, it seemed, was nowhere in sight. The police worked around the clock, but the case was already slipping into complexity. The trail had grown cold before it even began. With no suspects, no confessions, and no forensics pointing toward a clear direction, investigators found themselves trapped in a maze of dead ends, and Tyler's killer, whoever they were, had vanished like a ghost. The boy who once brought life to broken engines had become another broken story. Another face on a flyer, another son lowered into the ground far too soon, but who would do this and why? In the weeks following the discovery of Tyler Mancuso's body, Brookfield, New Jersey, became a town haunted by questions and silenced by a lack of answers. The case, once filled with urgency and hope, began to lose momentum. What had started with a massive search effort and intense media interest now simmered in the background. But for investigators and for Elise Mancuso, the search for justice had only just begun. Detectives began their next phase of the investigation by casting a wide net. They interviewed everyone in Tyler's circle, co-workers from Benson's auto shop, classmates from Brookfield High, neighbors, family friends, and even acquaintances from the local hardware store. They were looking for inconsistencies, grudges, obsessions, anything that could begin to form a narrative around the question, who would want to harm Tyler? But again and again they ran into the same wall. Tyler was well-liked, if quiet. His friends described him as introverted but kind. A bit shy but never cold. Tyler wasn't the kind of guy who made enemies, one classmate recalled. If anything, he avoided confrontation like the plague. He didn't have a girlfriend at the time of his death. No known romantic relationships that had ended badly. His school record was clean. He had no criminal history. There were no reports of bullying, no rivalries, no behavioral issues. The investigators explored a theory that maybe Tyler had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of random violence. A robbery gone wrong, a stranger attack. But if that were the case, why was nothing stolen from his car? His wallet was found intact. His phone had not been taken. Even the groceries he bought that night were still in the bag on the passenger seat. The crime made no sense. Then came the whispers. Some of Tyler's co-workers remembered seeing a strange man loitering near the garage in the weeks before Tyler vanished. He was described as middle-aged, scruffy, maybe in his 40s. He never came inside. Just stood outside the chain-link fence, sometimes watching, sometimes smoking. Chuck Benson remembered seeing the man once too. I figured he was just waiting for someone, he told detectives. Didn't think much of it. You get drifters now and then. The man was never identified. A composite sketch was made based on second-hand descriptions, but no one came forward to claim they knew him. No security footage existed to confirm his presence. The gas station next door had cameras, but those tapes, curiously, had been overwritten by the time detectives requested them. That wasn't the only oversight. Investigators found tire tracks near the location where Tyler's body had been buried. Deep grooves that cut across the mud in a sharp angle. It could have been the killer's vehicle, maybe even a small truck or van used to transport the body. But by the time forensic teams arrived, days of rain had obliterated any defining marks. The tires had been submerged in water and muck. No tread pattern could be lifted. No make or model could be determined. Even worse, detectives discovered that the vehicle impound log from the night Tyler's car was found had inconsistencies. The Civic had been towed, but the officer on duty failed to properly photograph the interior before removal. While the scene wasn't deemed compromised, the lack of photographic evidence was a glaring hole in the chain of custody. As these issues surfaced, so did rumors. People in town began whispering about mistakes, about how the early hours of Tyler's disappearance may have been mishandled, how the car hadn't been immediately treated as a potential crime scene, how delays in issuing a statewide alert may have cost precious time. The Brookfield Police Department pushed back. They insisted protocol had been followed, that every effort was being made, but privately, some officers admitted the investigation had suffered from early missteps. Evidence was minimal. Leads were drying up, and the media was losing interest. National coverage moved on to bigger headlines. Local outlets scaled back their reporting. Tyler's face, once printed on missing posters and news graphics, slowly began to fade from public consciousness. Leonard Mancuso refused to let that happen. She appeared on regional talk radio, gave interviews to local journalists, and started a small community Facebook group called Justice for Tyler. She posted updates daily, no matter how small. Photos of Tyler, quotes from friends, questions to the public. Someone knows something, she wrote in one post. Maybe they saw a car parked off the highway. Maybe they heard something in the woods. Please come forward. The page gained traction for a few weeks and then plateaued. Tips trickled in, but none held water. A woman in a nearby town claimed to have heard a scream the night of October 17th, but couldn't pinpoint the direction. A hunter claimed to see lights in the woods that week, but later admitted it might have been his imagination. Then there were the conspiracy theories. Some residents speculated about transient workers passing through. Others believed a known felon in the next county might be involved, though police quickly ruled him out. Online threads even suggested Tyler may have been targeted for something secret, a drug debt, a hidden relationship. But there was never evidence to support these claims. Investigators remained tight-lipped. Publicly, they insisted the case was active. Behind closed doors, they knew they were running out of options. Without a murder weapon, without fingerprints, without DNA pointing to anyone other than Tyler, the file began to grow cold. Every case has a tipping point. A moment where momentum either accelerates toward a solution or slides into stillness. For Tyler's case, that moment passed quietly. No grand development. No dramatic turn. Just time, relentless and unforgiving, moving forward. A year passed. Then two. By 2008, the task force assigned to the case had been downsized. New crimes demanded attention. Budgets were cut. Officers transferred. Leads stopped coming in. The Pine Hollow woods returned to silence. Tyler's name, once on everyone's lips, was now spoken in hushed tones, or not at all. A painful memory best left untouched. For Elise, the pain never dulled. She kept his room the same. His Civic, returned from impound, sat untouched in the driveway, flat tires, rusting doors, windshield slowly collecting dust and leaves. She still left the porch light on every night just in case. Brookfield tried to move on, but beneath the surface a lingering unease remained. Parents kept closer watch on their children. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. The forest, once a place of childhood exploration, became a landmark of tragedy. Chuck Benson never filled Tyler's position at the garage. Didn't feel right, he told a reporter once. Shop's been quieter ever since. The few people who still visited the woods often reported a strange stillness there. Like it remembers, someone once said. like the trees haven't forgotten what they hid. Every year on October 17th, Elise lit a candle by the front window. Sometimes neighbors joined her. Most years she stood alone, the town mourned. But mourning without justice becomes something heavier. It becomes desperation. Would anyone ever face justice for Tyler's death? By the spring of 2008, nearly 3 years after Tyler Mancuso vanished and was found buried in the Pine Hollow woods, the case had quietly slipped into what investigators dreaded most: cold status. The urgency that once crackled across radios and lit up press briefings had faded. New cases filled precinct whiteboards. New tragedies took over the headlines. And Tyler, once the heart of Brookfield's grief, became a photograph on a dusty corkboard in the police station hallway. The evidence box, labeled Mancuso Tyler, homicide, sat on a metal shelf in the back corner of the Brookfield PD evidence room. Inside it, the flannel shirt recovered near his body, a list of interviews, the original crime scene photos, and dozens of typed reports. Stacked and sealed. Silent. For Elise Mancuso, time didn't move with the same indifference. She marked every birthday with a candle, lit in silence by her son's framed graduation photo, every holiday with an empty chair. Every October 17th, the day Tyler disappeared, she left the porch light on and sat awake until dawn. At first, she gave interviews. Local news channels, regional newspapers, even a podcast once, all promising to keep the story alive. But as the months passed, those promises dried up. New tragedies always arrived. Tyler's story didn't trend. It didn't fit the 24-hour cycle. One reporter apologized via email. "We just don't have room this week," she wrote. Elise never replied. Back at the precinct, detectives who had once pored over maps and suspect lists were reassigned. Budgets were cut. A new chief came in, promising reform, but had little to say about old cases. Officers rotated in and out. New faces looked at Tyler's file without context. Just another cold case, just another name. The only constant was Elise. She refused to let go. She collected every article ever written about Tyler. She kept a timeline taped to her kitchen wall. She reached out to state senators, to retired detectives, to anyone she thought might listen. She even wrote to the FBI. Most didn't respond. The town of Brookfield, meanwhile, did what small towns do. It healed in private, in pieces. The name Tyler was no longer on the evening news or in school assemblies. It lived in murmurs, whispered at church, spoken softly when someone passed his mother in the grocery store. Some residents still left flowers on the edge of the woods. Others avoided the topic altogether. Life went on. The Civic Tyler had driven that night, returned from the impound lot with a shattered sense of closure, remained parked in the family driveway. Elise refused to sell it. "It's the last thing he touched," she once told a neighbor. "It still smells like him." The engine hadn't been started in years. Rust climbed the doors. The windshield collected dead leaves. A blue tarp covered it half the year. But to Elise it was sacred. She still visited his grave every Sunday. The headstone, modest and gray, bore his full name and the dates 1987-2005. Weeds grew between the stones. She knelt and trimmed them herself with kitchen scissors every week. She had asked the cemetery director once why no maintenance was done there. He told her quietly, "Funding's tight. Not enough staff." That phrase had become too familiar. Funding's tight. Not enough staff. Not enough time. Not enough justice. In 2009, Elise organized a candlelight vigil, hoping to reignite interest, to gather the community again. 27 people showed up. A far cry from the hundreds that had once lined the streets. Still, she lit Tyler's candle first. A local pastor read a prayer. Chuck Benson, still running the shop where Tyler once worked, said a few words. "He never let a car leave without checking it twice," Chuck said. "I still wait for him to walk in the door some mornings." But most of the town had moved on. Kids who'd gone to school with Tyler had graduated, left for college, started families. New families had moved into Brookfield. Ones who didn't recognize his name, didn't know the story. To them, Pine Hollow was just a patch of woods. The past wasn't part of the welcome packet. Despite the silence, Elise kept Tyler's memory alive. She created binders of every lead, every false tip, every rumor. She emailed the cold case division of the state police every 6 months like clockwork. Sometimes they responded with a polite acknowledgement. Sometimes they didn't respond at all. In 2011, she began mailing letters to the governor's office requesting a review of the case. No reply. In 2012, she mailed one every month. She started calling every elected official listed on the state website. Most calls ended with vague reassurances. "We'll look into it. It's on file. Thank you for your persistence." That word, persistence. It started to feel like both compliment and curse, and yet even as the world forgot, Elise kept remembering. In Tyler's room, she maintained a kind of shrine. His favorite flannel shirt folded neatly on the bed. A few of his notebooks. A photo of him and his grandfather fixing a go-kart. A keychain with the shop's logo. She never moved anything. There was something sacred about preserving it, as though any shift in his room might erase the pieces of him still left behind. Once a year, Elise went through the contents of the evidence box the police had let her access. A copy, not the original. Photos, transcripts, copies of maps. She would spread it all out on the dining room table and start again. Rebuild the timeline. Reread the statements. Search for something missed. She was no detective, but she refused to be just a mother in mourning. She would be Tyler's advocate, until the very end. And then, in 2015, a friend mailed her a newspaper clipping from another state. A case solved after 22 years, thanks to new DNA technology. The article mentioned something called genetic genealogy and how it had helped track down a killer who had never even been a suspect. Elise clipped that article and taped it above Tyler's bed. That same week, she sent another letter, this one to the State Cold Case Review Board, newly formed under a law passed the previous year. She attached the article. She attached copies of Tyler's case file summaries. She made her case once again. And then she waited. Because while the world had long since stopped asking, she never had. And she had one question that refused to go away. Could technology bring justice when time had failed? In early 2023, nearly 18 years after Tyler Mancuso's murder, the tide of justice quietly began to shift. It didn't come with flashing lights or breaking news headlines. It began in a modest office within the newly established New Jersey State Cold Case Unit, a division born out of mounting pressure from victims' families, media scrutiny, and growing public demand to re-examine the backlog of unsolved cases. At the center of this movement was Detective Carla Jennings. Jennings wasn't a name anyone in Brookfield would have recognized at the time. She was new to the unit, transferred in from Camden after years of investigating violent crimes, quiet but relentless. Jennings had built a reputation for meticulous file work and a deep belief that every victim, no matter how long ago they were lost, deserved closure. Tyler Mancuso's case was one of the earliest she pulled from the shelf. The file was thick, aged, and weighed down by nearly 2 decades of grief. Jennings spread its contents across her desk like puzzle pieces. Autopsy reports, interview transcripts, crime scene photos, maps, diagrams. There were handwritten notes from original detectives, press clippings yellowed with time, and evidence logs with check marks and initials long faded. She didn't know Tyler, but she quickly saw the boy through the paper. Trail. A quiet teen with oil under his nails, and a future he'd never lived to see. What struck Jennings most was how little forensic evidence had been successfully analyzed in the early days. A limited sample set, no usable DNA, and the technology in 2005, primitive by today's standards, particularly in a small-town department already working with stretched resources. Then she noticed it, a brief mention in the crime scene log. Foreign hair fragment recovered 18 inches from burial site. The hair had been collected, bagged and stored, but at the time it had been deemed unusable. Too degraded, no root, and no caudus match when initially tested. The fragment had been shelved with dozens of other items, but 2023 was not 2005. With the explosion of genealogical DNA databases and enhanced forensic techniques, even a degraded hair could now potentially reveal a trail, especially if the focus was not a direct hit, but familial tracing, building a family tree based on shared DNA segments with distant relatives who had willingly submitted their data to public genealogy services. Jennings filed a request for the hair to be re-examined. The lab, now equipped with next-generation sequencing tools, got to work. It took weeks, but the DNA was viable. A partial profile was extracted. It wasn't enough for a CODIS match, but it was enough for the next step: genetic genealogy. Jennings partnered with a genetic genealogist contracted by the state. They uploaded the DNA profile into public databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, platforms where users had consented to law enforcement access. The hope wasn't to find the killer outright, but to find people related to him, even distantly. Within weeks, the results began to filter in. Fourth cousins. Third cousins shared DNA segments, names, lineages, a tangled web of branches that, if traced correctly, could lead to the source. The genealogist began building a family tree, one node at a time. It was painstaking work. Census records, marriage licenses, obituaries, immigration documents, all used to map out the tree. They built forward from distant cousins toward a common ancestor, and then back down toward modern-day descendants. It took nearly 4 months to identify a narrowed pool of potential individuals. One stood out: Leonard Ray Dorsey. 46-year-old man with a criminal record spanning multiple states: assault, domestic violence, unlawful possession of weapons. No murder convictions, but a pattern of violent behavior that had escalated in the early 2000s. He had bounced around jobs, lived under aliases, been arrested twice but always managed to plea down or move on before cases stuck. What made the hair on Jennings's neck stand up wasn't just his past, it was his geography. Dorsey had lived in Brookfield in 2005, not just in town, less than 2 miles from Benson's auto shop, where Tyler had worked. And yet his name had never come up in the original investigation. Not once. He hadn't been on any interview list, hadn't been mentioned by neighbors, no fingerprints on file in connection to the case. He had left town shortly after Tyler's murder and hadn't returned since. Jennings dug deeper. Dorsey had worked, briefly, as a part-time delivery driver for a warehouse near Route 48. The job had ended 2 weeks before Tyler vanished. No disciplinary actions, no red flags in the file, but it placed him in the area. And it placed him with a vehicle, one capable of transporting a body. Jennings found that he'd been arrested in 2009 for an unrelated assault in Pennsylvania. He'd served time, then relocated to Trenton under a new address registered to a family member. He was living under the radar, not hiding but certainly not standing out. Jennings presented her findings to the cold case unit's supervising officer. The DNA match wasn't direct, but it was close. The geographical link, the timing, the history of violence. It was enough to move forward. Surveillance was approved. Dorsey was placed under quiet observation. They watched, waited, monitored his movements, his habits, his online activity. Nothing flashy, nothing overtly incriminating. He worked odd jobs, stayed mostly to himself. Then came the break. Jennings submitted a subpoena for Dorsey's discarded trash. From a bag left on the curb, investigators recovered a coffee cup, a napkin, and a cigarette butt. Each item was swabbed. The results came back within 2 weeks. The cigarette butt matched the DNA profile built from the hair recovered near Tyler's burial site. The match was strong, statistically rare, a near-perfect link. Jennings had her suspect, but the question remained: was Dorsey the killer? Or just someone whose DNA had made its way to the woods through some other means? The cold case unit needed more. Jennings returned to Brookfield. Quietly. She re-interviewed a few of Tyler's former co-workers. A few remembered a man matching Dorsey's description, lingering near the shop in the weeks before the murder. One remembered him asking about job openings. Another recalled seeing a white panel van parked behind the lot late one evening. A van Dorsey had owned at the time. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to form. Dorsey hadn't just been in Brookfield. He had inserted himself into the fringes of Tyler's world, watching, waiting, maybe even interacting. The motive remained unclear. Random violence? A confrontation turned deadly? Or something darker? Jennings knew she wouldn't get those answers from files. She needed to talk to him. A warrant was issued. In July 2024, Dorsey was brought in for questioning. He denied everything, said he didn't know Tyler, claimed he'd never been to Pine Hollow Woods, said he was living in another county in 2005. a claim quickly disproven by employment records and rental history. Jennings confronted him with the DNA, matched. Dorsey's confidence faltered. His story began to shift. He claimed he might have passed through Brookfield, said maybe he'd met someone near a garage but couldn't recall the name. But still, no confession. Still, no motive. What Jennings had was circumstantial, but powerful. DNA, proximity, history of violence untraceable in 2005, crystal clear in 2023. Still, the looming question echoed in her mind. Was Dorsey truly Tyler's killer, or just another dead lead? On a cold January morning in 2025, a routine stop at a gas station in Trenton, New Jersey, marked the end of a two-decade mystery. Leonard Ray Dorsey, a 46-year-old man with a long-forgotten connection to Brookfield, was quietly approached by two plainclothes officers while pumping gas into his aging sedan. They asked his name. When he confirmed it, they moved in. He didn't run. There were no dramatic protests. No struggle. Just a flicker of recognition in his eyes, as if he'd known this moment would eventually come. Dorsey was taken into custody without incident and transported to the New Jersey State Police headquarters for processing. He was informed of the charges: suspicion of homicide in connection with the 2005 murder of Tyler James Mancuso. For a town like Brookfield, the news hit like a thunderclap. Few people remembered Dorsey's name. Fewer still could put a face to it. But when word spread that a suspect had been arrested, and not just any suspect but someone who had once lived among them, the shock settled in like fog over the town. A man who had walked their streets, shopped at their stores, lurked on the edges of their memories, now accused of one of their darkest crimes. At police headquarters, Detective Carla Jennings prepared for the interrogation with meticulous precision. She reviewed every page of the case file, every statement, every forensic detail, every timeline inconsistency. This wasn't just about securing a confession. This was about exposing the full weight of the truth. When Dorsey was brought into the room, he appeared calm, almost disinterested. He wore a worn hoodie, faded jeans, and carried an air of defiance wrapped in fatigue. But Jennings had seen this demeanor before. It was a shield. She began with the basics: his name, his birth date, his employment history. He answered. She asked if he remembered living in Brookfield. He paused, then admitted he had, briefly. Said he'd worked delivery routes for a warehouse off Route 48, couldn't recall the exact dates. Claimed he left the town because there was nothing there for him. Then came the questions about Tyler. At first, Dorsey denied knowing anyone named Tyler Mancuso. No idea who that is, he said flatly. Jennings watched his eyes. No flicker of recognition. No emotion. She shifted gears, asked if he remembered a small auto shop called Benson's. This time he nodded. Said he might have stopped by once or twice, maybe to ask about work. But nothing more. Jennings pressed. Brought up the reports of a man seen near the shop in 2005. Loitering, smoking, watching. Dorsey shrugged. Wasn't me, he said. Then she showed him the photo, a copy of the composite sketch drawn from old witness memories. It wasn't an exact match, but it was close enough. Still, Dorsey denied everything. Finally, Jennings laid out the DNA results. The hair recovered near Tyler's burial site. The familial match through genealogical testing. The cigarette butt recovered from Dorsey's trash in 2024. A perfect match to the profile pulled from the crime scene. The room changed. Dorsey leaned back. His lips tightened. His fingers began tapping the metal table. That doesn't prove I killed anybody, he muttered. Jennings didn't reply. She let the silence expand, the weight of the moment pressing down between them. Dorsey looked away. People drop stuff all the time. Could have been from before. Could have been planted, but his voice had lost its certainty. Over the next few hours, his story began to shift. He admitted he might have seen the kid once or twice. Said he might have talked to him, then backtracked. Claimed he couldn't remember. As the interrogation wore on, Dorsey floated theories. Maybe someone else used his DNA. Maybe someone found a cigarette he dropped and planted it. Maybe he had walked through the woods once years ago and left hair behind. Each excuse only tightened the circle. Jennings didn't need a confession. She had enough for the arrest. But what she wanted, what Tyler's family needed, was the truth. A why, but that never came. Dorsey didn't confess. Not that day, not the next. What came instead was a growing case file, one that investigators worked tirelessly to strengthen in preparation for the coming trial. They traced Dorsey's past employment records, confirming he worked at the Brookfield warehouse in the fall of 2005, and quit abruptly just 2 days after Tyler's body was discovered. His supervisor at the time, when contacted in 2025, admitted it was weird timing, but never raised it back then. Police also re-interviewed residents who lived near the auto shop. Several remembered seeing a white van with no company markings parked along the alley behind Benson's during that time. At least one neighbor remembered seeing a man who resembled Dorsey outside the shop after hours. These memories, long buried under years of silence, slowly surfaced again. Brookfield was rattled. For years, the assumption had been that Tyler had either encountered a stranger or simply crossed paths with the wrong person at the wrong time. Now they learned that the killer, the man who may have watched Tyler, approached him, possibly lured him into a vehicle, had lived among them. Leonard Dorsey had blended into the fabric of the town just enough to disappear. A temp worker, a face you didn't question, a man in the background, and then he vanished, just like Tyler. But Dorsey had the benefit of silence, of time, of a system that for nearly 20 years hadn't connected the dots, until science did what the system couldn't. Back in Brookfield, the arrest sent ripples through the community. Parents who once feared the case would never be solved held their children a little closer. Teachers at Brookfield High referenced the case in quiet hallway conversations. The new generation of students, and those who hadn't even been born when Tyler died, began asking questions. Tyler's mother, Elise, received the call she'd dreamed about and dreaded in equal measure. "We've made an arrest." She didn't cry, not at first. She sat in silence, the phone still pressed to her ear long after the call ended. Later that evening, she pulled out a worn manila envelope, filled with timelines, photos, newspaper clippings, and typed letters she had mailed to officials over the years. She placed it on the kitchen table where it had always belonged and whispered, "We're not done yet." The town held a vigil the following week, not one of mourning, but of quiet resolve. A candle was lit in Tyler's honor, just as it had been every year. But this time there was something different in the air. There was movement, there was consequence. But for all the relief, there were still questions. Why had Dorsey targeted Tyler? Was it premeditated? A crime of opportunity? A random act from a dangerous man? And most importantly, would the justice system finally deliver what the town had long awaited? The trial of Leonard Ray Dorsey began on a rainy Tuesday morning in May 2025, nearly 2 decades after the murder of Tyler James Mancuso. The courthouse, a weathered building tucked into the heart of the county seat, was surrounded by local news vans and quiet clusters of onlookers. For many in Brookfield and beyond, this wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning, not only for a man, but for a system that had failed to deliver justice for 18 long years. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Rows of wooden pews creaked under the weight of grief, anticipation, and disbelief. At the front, just behind the prosecution's table, sat Elise Mancuso. She clutched a small framed photo of her son, Tyler in his work uniform, grease-smudged, smiling gently into the lens. She had carried that photo through every stage of the investigation. Now she brought it into court, as if to remind everyone who this trial was truly about. Opening statements set the tone. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Klein, wasted no time laying out the stakes. She pointed to the weight of the evidence, the hair found near Tyler's burial site, the DNA match from the cigarette butt recovered from Dorsey's trash, his proximity to the auto shop in 2005, and his history of violence. Klein reminded the jury that justice had been delayed for far too long, but that it didn't have to be denied. The defense, headed by court-appointed attorney Michael Graves, struck a different chord. He called the case deeply emotional but dangerously circumstantial. Graves acknowledged that Dorsey had a troubled past, but insisted that the prosecution was trying to convict his client not based on proof, but on probability. No murder weapon had been recovered. There was no confession, no eyewitness to the crime itself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Graves told the jury, "this is a tragic case. But you are not here to heal wounds, you are here to weigh evidence. And there are more questions in this case than answers." Over the next 3 weeks, both sides presented their case in painstaking detail. The prosecution's timeline began on October 17, 2005. They brought in forensic experts to explain the nature of the DNA match. A genetic genealogist testified about the process of building a family tree from the partial DNA profile, walking the jury through the method that led them to Dorsey. Then came the medical examiner, who detailed Tyler's injuries, a fatal blow to the skull likely inflicted by a blunt object. Photos of the remains were shown. The courtroom fell silent. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Elise looked away, holding her son's photo close to her chest. Witnesses included Tyler's former co-workers, who recalled seeing a strange man loitering near Benson's auto shop in the weeks before the murder. One of them identified Dorsey in court, stating that he was almost certain he had seen him across the street, leaning against a van, watching. Dorsey's employment records were introduced. They confirmed he had been working at a warehouse less than 2 miles from the crime scene in 2005. His sudden departure, just days after Tyler's body was discovered, raised more eyebrows. Finally, Detective Carla Jennings took the stand. She walked the jury through the reopening of the cold case, the discovery of the old evidence, the application of new DNA technology, and the chain of events that led to Dorsey's arrest. Calm, measured, and precise, she painted a portrait of a case once buried in silence, now reborn through science and perseverance. The defense worked tirelessly to poke holes in the narrative. They called their own forensic expert to challenge the reliability of the DNA methods used. The expert argued that genealogical DNA is inherently probabilistic, and that building a family tree doesn't guarantee a match, only a strong possibility. They criticized the use of public databases, hinting at privacy violations and statistical error. Graves also attempted to dismantle the witness credibility. Memory, he argued, fades. 18 years is a long time. Faces blur. Details shift. Are we convicting a man based on shadows and speculation? He asked. He emphasized the lack of motive. No evidence was presented that Dorsey had ever interacted with Tyler directly. No threatening messages. No history of conflict. "People with criminal records live near victims all the time," he said. "That does not make them killers." But the prosecution didn't flinch. They countered that Dorsey didn't need to have a personal connection to Tyler. That many crimes are crimes of opportunity. That a man with a history of aggression, living within walking distance of the victim's workplace, suddenly quitting and vanishing, that was more than coincidence. In her closing arguments, Ada Rachel Klein looked the jury in the eye and said, "You may not have every piece of the puzzle, but the picture is clear. This was not random. This was not abstract. Leonard Ray Dorsey murdered Tyler James Mancuso and tried to bury both the body and the truth. But DNA doesn't forget, and neither should we." The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom filled with hushed breaths and braced hearts. Elise held her son's photo a little tighter, her hands trembling slightly. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreperson stood. "We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant, Leonard Ray Dorsey, guilty of first-degree murder." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Elise closed her eyes, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. She whispered, "Thank you," into the quiet. Though whether to the jury, to God, or to Tyler, no one could say. Sentencing was swift. Dorsey showed no emotion as he was handed life in prison without the possibility of parole. He stood still as the judge read the sentence. No apology, no plea. Just silence. After the verdict, the media descended once again. Headlines declared cold case solved after 20 years, killer convicted in Tyler Mancuso murder. Commentators praised the power of DNA technology. Some hailed it as a milestone for genetic genealogy in law enforcement. But not everyone saw closure. In the courtroom hallway, Elise addressed a small crowd of reporters. Her voice was steady, but grief still clung to every word. "I want to thank the cold case unit and Detective Jennings for never giving up. I want to thank the jury for seeing the truth. But I also want to ask, why did it take 20 years? Why was this man never questioned back in 2005? How many other mothers are still waiting for someone to care about their child's file? The questions hung in the air, because while justice had been served for Tyler, the trial raised painful truths about the system meant to protect him. Dorsey's name had never appeared in the original investigation. A man with a violent history living just minutes from the scene had been invisible, overlooked, forgotten. What files had been ignored? What tips dismissed? What other cases were still gathering dust in evidence rooms just like Tyler's had? If not for science and if not for one detective reopening the file, would this case have remained unsolved forever? The justice system had delivered a verdict, but for Brookfield, and for the countless families still waiting in the dark, the deeper question remained. What will it take to ensure no other family waits 20 years for justice? Brookfield looks much the same as it did in 2005. The main street still boasts the same brick storefronts. The diner still serves pancakes with too much syrup. The high school parking lot still fills with half-running hand-me-down cars each morning. But for those who lived through it, for those who remember Tyler Mancuso, there's a quiet difference stitched into the fabric of the town. It's in the way people pause when they pass the auto shop on Millstone Avenue, Benson's Auto, where Tyler once worked afternoons and weekends, now has a framed black and white photo of him hanging just above the service desk. In the picture, Tyler stands beside a rusty Ford Bronco, holding a wrench, sleeves rolled up, a shy smile on his face. Beneath the frame is a small brass plaque that reads, "In memory of Tyler Mancuso, a quiet light. Never forgotten." Chuck Benson, who still owns the shop, says not a day goes by that someone doesn't glance at the photo and ask about the boy who used to work there. Some are new to town. Some are too young to remember the trial, but curious enough to ask. When they do, Chuck says, I tell them the truth, that he was a good kid, that he worked hard, that someone took him from this world too soon, and that we still remember. Across town, Brookfield High School now hosts an annual scholarship in Tyler's name. The Mancuso Technical Trades Scholarship is awarded each spring to a student pursuing a career in automotive repair or engineering. It was his mother's idea. Elise Mancuso has become something of a local advocate, not just for her son's memory but for victims' families everywhere. After the trial ended and Leonard Dorsey was sentenced to life in prison, Elise could have retreated from public life. No one would have blamed her. But instead, she stepped forward. She began visiting schools, speaking about Tyler, about grief, about strength, about what it means to keep going when the world forgets. Her talks aren't rehearsed. She doesn't use PowerPoint or slides. She simply stands, often holding the same photo she carried during the trial, and tells the story of a boy who never made it home. At one event, a student asked her what she missed most about Tyler. Elise paused, then said his voice. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it meant something. The room fell silent. Through the years, Elise pushed for more than just remembrance. She pushed for change. She met with lawmakers. She joined cold case advocacy groups. She testified at hearings about the backlog of untested DNA evidence in the state's forensic labs. In 2026, partially because of her tireless campaigning, the New Jersey legislature passed a funding initiative aimed specifically at resolving cold cases. The initiative provided increased resources for DNA testing, expanded the state's genetic genealogy capabilities, and established dedicated cold case units in 5 counties, including the one where Tyler's case was first mishandled. It was called the Mancuso Act. At the bill's signing ceremony, Elise stood beside the governor holding Tyler's photo. Tears in her eyes, "We can't bring him back," she said to the cameras, "but we can make sure no other mother waits 20 years to know what happened to her child." Brookfield itself made changes, too. The small stretch of road leading into Pine Hollow Woods, once just Route 48's forgotten bypass, was officially renamed Mancuso Way in 2025. A new sign, deep blue with bold white letters, now stands near the bend where Tyler's car was found that night in October 2005. People still drive past it daily. Some barely notice, but others slow down, not because of traffic but because of memory. The woods, once feared and avoided, have since become a space of reflection. A memorial bench was installed at the trailhead, donated by local businesses and community members. Etched into the wood is a simple line, "For Tylers who never got to grow old." Every October 17th, people gather there. Not just Elise, but teachers, classmates, former co-workers. Even strangers. They light candles. They say his name. They remember. Not just the boy who died, but the boy who lived. They remember how he stayed late at the shop to finish brake jobs, how he shoveled snow for neighbors without being asked, how he wore the same flannel jacket every fall because it reminded him of his grandfather. They remember how he once spent an entire weekend rebuilding an engine with parts from a junkyard just to prove to himself that he could. Tyler never got to open his own garage. He never got to graduate from tech school or teach other kids like himself. He never got to grow old or start a family. But in Brookfield, his story became something larger. It became a reminder that justice may sleep, but it never disappears, that even when the world forgets, someone, somewhere, will remember. For Tyler, that someone was his mother. And now, it's a whole town. Young people grow up hearing his story. They pass by the street named after him. They see his photo in the shop. They read his name on the scholarship forms. And they learn early on that some lives, even if cut short, leave echoes that last for generations. The ripple effects of Tyler's case extended far beyond the courtroom. It changed how evidence is stored in the state. It introduced new protocols for how missing persons are treated in the first 48 hours. It encouraged departments across New Jersey to re-examine their own cold cases. Using modern DNA tools and genetic genealogy, dozens of dormant files were reopened, and in several cases arrests were made. In this way, Tyler's story didn't just lead to justice for himself, it became a catalyst for justice for others, a force, a legacy. At one of Elise's talks in 2027, she ended her speech with a line that would later be inscribed beneath Tyler's photograph at the courthouse. Justice delayed is still justice, but justice forgotten, that's the real tragedy. Don't forget the ones who wait in silence, Brookfield. Didn't forget, and neither did the state, because Tyler's story, once buried beneath pine needles and time, had found new life in the voices of a community that refused to let him be erased, not as a cautionary tale, not as a statistic, but as a promise that someone's life, no matter how quiet or short, can still make a difference. A boy who fixed engines and dreamed of owning his own garage became the reason other cold cases were solved. The reason laws changed, the reason one mother's grief reshaped an entire system. And so the question lingers, long after the candles are blown out and the streets grow silent again. What legacy do we leave for those we lose? Tyler James Mancuso was more than a cold case, more than a file in a cabinet, and more than a statistic in a forgotten report. He was a son, a classmate, a quiet dreamer with oil on his hands and purpose in his heart. His 2005 murder shattered a small New Jersey town, and as the years stretched into decades, silence nearly buried him for good. But Tyler's mother never let go. She carried his memory through interviews no one aired, through vigils that dwindled in attendance, through nights with the porch light on. She held on to hope when everyone else had moved on. In the end, it wasn't just persistence that brought justice, it was progress. When DNA technology finally caught up, a fragment of hair, forgotten in a box, became the voice Tyler had been denied. That voice led to an arrest, a trial, and a conviction that gave closure, but not peace. Because peace doesn't come just from one case closed. It comes from a system learning to remember what it forgets. Tyler's case revealed deep cracks in how evidence is handled, how leads are followed, how quickly momentum fades. But it also showed what's possible when justice refuses to quit. His legacy now lives in law, in reform, in the young hands that hold wrenches and receive scholarships in his name. It lives in a street sign, a memorial bench, a mother's voice echoing in school auditoriums. If justice delayed is still justice, then let it never be silenced. Let Tyler's memory carry it forward, for every case still waiting and every voice yet to be heard. Remember Tyler, remember them all.